All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of oil. Something I know is a big one for you guys. You sent over some really fascinating stuff, including Oil 101 by Morgan Downey.
Right.
And I think, our mission here is, as always, to distill it down and give you the core insights so you can feel like you really understand this industry.
Yeah.
Without having to wade through all the super technical details.
Yeah. A high-level overview, kind of an analyst focus.
Right, exactly, an analyst focus. So not going deep into the engineering and geology of it all,
Right.
but really trying to understand the fundamentals of this market. So what are we going to cover today? We are going to start with a brief history of oil.
Okay.
Which might surprise you.
Yeah.
Then we are going to talk about all the amazing things that are made out of oil.
Wow.
I mean, you wouldn't believe it. The variety of products that come from a single barrel of crude. Then we are going to demystify the world of oil pricing. How does this, crazy up and down world, how does that actually happen? How are these prices set? And who's really in control?
Right.
Then we are going to break the oil industry down into its key sectors, upstream, midstream, and downstream.
Okay.
And finally, we're going to navigate the often overlooked but crucial world of oil transportation. Have you ever stopped to think about how something pulled out of the ground ends up as the gas in your car and all these other products that we use every day?
Yeah.
It's truly fascinating.
Yeah, it's a global system.
Yeah.
It is. And understanding those building blocks really helps us to grasp its overall significance.
Right. All right. So let's go back in time, back to the early days. Let's talk about the history of oil.
Okay.
Seems like it's been around forever, but its real importance is relatively recent.
Yeah. I mean, for most of human history, oil was a curiosity, right? There were places in the Middle East, where people observed it seeping out of the ground. As early as 4000 BC, the Chinese were using oil for lamps and heating. In the Middle East, they used it for construction and as a waterproofing agent.
Okay.
One of the most striking facts is that the Byzantine Empire, they used crude oil in a flame-throwing weapon.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's kind of an early demonstration of its energy potential.
Oh, yeah.
If a little bit aggressive.
Wow. A flame-throwing weapon.
Yeah.
That changes my perception of what early oil usage looked like. So it sounds like it was more of a local curiosity, a niche application way back then.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't until the 19th century that things really started to change.
Okay.
The 1840s in Pennsylvania, there's a guy named Samuel Keir.
Okay.
He owned a salt mine. And he noticed that there was oil interfering with his salt operation. And instead of just dismissing it, he actually had the idea to bottle and market it as a medicinal cure-all.
Really?
Yeah, he called it Keir's Petroleum, or rock oil.
A cure-all? Okay, was it actually any good? Medicine?
I don't know about that.
I don't know either.
I think its effectiveness as medicine is debatable at best.
Right.
But his efforts were important because they planted the seed of this idea that this substance might have value, And then in the 1850s, others began to see an even bigger market for oil, its potential as a fuel for lamps.
Okay.
Which was obviously a critical need in the world.
Yeah, of course. I mean, before widespread electrification, that was a big deal.
Exactly.
So it makes sense. So, okay, so we have this transition from a kind of wacky medical claim to a much more legitimate lighting fuel.
Yeah.
What was the real turning point? What was the catalyst that launched the oil industry as we know it?
Yeah, well, in 1854, George Bissell and a group of his business partners, they sent a sample of Pennsylvania oil to Professor Benjamin Silliman at Yale University to determine if it had any other practical uses, particularly for illumination. And what Silliman discovered was that crude oil could be distilled into lamp fuel, a form of kerosene. So that was the real aha moment.
Okay.
That revealed the genuine commercial potential of oil on a massive scale.
So it all started with a quest for better lighting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And that process of turning crude oil into lamp fuel, how did that work, at a basic level?
Yeah, so what Silliman figured out was that if you heat crude oil, different components vaporize at different temperatures.
Right.
So they have different boiling points. And these vapors could then be captured and condensed separately. So this principle of separating out the components of crude oil by heating and condensation, that's essentially the basis of oil refining.
Okay.
Even today. Although Obviously, the techniques have gotten far more sophisticated.
Yeah, but that's a core idea. So we've gone from questionable medicine to valuable lighting fuel. What happens next? I imagine this increasing demand probably led to some big players emerging, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the early days of the oil industry, there was a lot of consolidation. And the name that really stands out is John D. Rockefeller.
Yeah.
And his company, Standard Oil.
Oh, yeah.
Beginning in the 1860s, Rockefeller built a commanding position in the industry, really by focusing on efficiency and controlling costs across the entire supply chain, from production to transportation. And by 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the U.S. oil market.
90%?
90%.
That is a textbook monopoly. How did he manage to pull that off?
His real genius was streamlining everything at every stage, but also, crucially, he controlled the transportation infrastructure, which gave him a huge advantage over competitors. But as you can imagine, that much control attracted attention from the government. And in 1911, Standard Oil was broken up into 34 independent companies because of antitrust legislation. So it's kind of ironic that this breakup, which was supposed to encourage competition, actually laid the foundation for many of the oil companies that we know today.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So we started with lighting.
Yeah.
But obviously oil is used for so much more now. When did that demand really shift? Like, when did we see this huge increase in demand for oil?
The early 20th century, things really changed. With the arrival of the automobile. Henry Ford's Model T, initially, was designed to run on ethanol. But it quickly transitioned to gasoline, a product of oil refining. And that created a whole new massive source of demand for oil. And around the same time, oil also started being used to power boats, airplanes, and trains. So it became much more than just about lighting at that point.
Yeah, so the internal combustion engine changed everything for oil.
Yeah.
And to meet that demand, new oil fields were being discovered at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the early 20th century, major oil fields were found. In Texas, Oklahoma, California. The Spindletop Gusher in Texas, 1901. Was a landmark event. It kind of marked the beginning of this large-scale oil production in the U.S.
So we've gone from these small surface seeps to these huge underground reservoirs. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got all this crude oil coming out of the ground.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Okay.
What do we do with it?
Yeah.
What does it become? I know gasoline is a big one.
Right.
But what else?
Yeah, crude oil in its raw form, you can't really use it for much.
Right.
It has to be processed, refined to create all of those useful products that we need. And Downey's Oil 101 does a really good job of breaking down these different fractions and all of the individual products that come out of them. Think of it this way, right? Refining is like separating out all the valuable parts of this complex mixture.
So what are the main categories of ingredients, I guess, that we get out of this refining process?
Yeah. Okay, so first you have petroleum gases. Things like methane, ethane, propane, butanes. You know, those are familiar to most people, right? Natural gas. Used for heating and cooking. But they're also really important petrochemical feedstocks. So the raw materials used to create other things, like plastics and synthetic fibers.
So when I'm using my natural gas furnace or my propane grill, I'm using those petroleum gases.
Yeah, exactly. And then you move into the light ends. Mostly naphtha. Now, you wouldn't buy naphtha at the store, but it's an essential component in gasoline blending. And again, it's an important petrochemical feedstock. Naphtha itself is further divided into light and heavy naphtha, depending on its boiling point during this refining process.
So naphtha is a key ingredient in lots of other things.
Yeah, right.
What comes after that?
Then we have the middle distillates. And this is where we find the major fuels for transportation and heating. So things like gasolines for cars and for aviation. Kerosene, which includes jet fuel. And light gas oils, which are used to make heating oil and diesel fuel. These are really important for keeping our economies moving and our homes warm. So they're grouped together because they all boil off in the middle temperature range.
So gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. The big ones. The things that power our world. So what about what's left over after we take out those light ends? What are the heavy things that remain?
The heavier fractions. yield the heavy fuel oils, which are used for things like marine bunker fuel for ships and some power generation. But then there's this whole range of specialty products. So this includes base oils that are used to make lubricants, the finished lubricants themselves, that keep machinery running. Waxes, which are used in everything.
Really?
Yeah. From candles to food packaging, to seal and preserve food. Bitumen and asphalt, which pave our roads. Petroleum coke, that's used in manufacturing. And even carbon black, which is a key ingredient in tires.
Wow. I never would have thought about waxes in food packaging or bitumen in roads.
Yeah.
I mean, it really shows you how much we rely on crude oil for so many different things.
Right.
It's not just, the gas in our cars. It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's really woven into the fabric of modern life.
Yeah.
In a way that most people probably don't even realize.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's switch gears a little bit now. Let's talk about oil prices.
Okay.
Something that's always in the news, right?
Yeah.
How are those prices actually set? And who are the major players that influence those prices?
Well, it's a complex question, and it's got a lot of history. In the early days of the U.S. oil boom, the Texas Railroad Commission, they had a lot of power. And they actually tried to regulate production levels to stabilize prices.
Yeah.
And this went on until the early 1970s.
So you had this regulatory body actively involved in managing prices.
Yeah, exactly. They had this system of quotas.
Wow.
And controls. But then the global picture changed a lot with the rise of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, in the 1960s and 70s. And as these member nations gained control of their own oil resources, OPEC's influence over global supply and therefore pricing became really significant. And the Arab oil embargo of 73, 74 really demonstrated that power shift.
Right, the oil embargo.
Yeah.
A big moment. So does that mean OPEC now just sets the price of oil?
Well, not exactly. I mean, OPEC's decisions about how much oil to produce have a huge influence, but they don't completely control the price. Global demand is also a major factor.
Right.
And that changes all the time.
Of course.
And then, economic conditions worldwide.
Right.
Geopolitical events, wars, political instability. These things can all create volatility and impact prices.
Yeah.
So it's this really complicated mix of supply and demand, with OPEC being a big player.
Yeah.
But not the only player.
Okay, so it's a lot of things. But when we see oil prices quoted, we often hear about benchmarks.
Right.
Like West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude. What are those?
Those are the two most important crude oil benchmarks in the world. West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, is traded on the New York Mercantile Exchange, NYMX. And Brent crude is traded on ICE Futures Europe. And these benchmarks are important because they're used as reference points for pricing almost all of the oil traded internationally.
So when you see the news and it says, oil is trading at $85 a barrel, they're probably talking about one of those two.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
They're both specific types of crude with specific characteristics and delivery locations. Which makes them suitable to be used as standards for trading in the futures markets.
And how does that buying and selling actually happen? I always hear about futures contracts.
Right, yeah. So the main way people trade these benchmarks is through futures contracts. Which are agreements to buy or sell a certain amount of oil at a specific price on a future date. And those contracts, each one of those represents 1,000 barrels of oil for both WTI and Brent. And these contracts are constantly being bought and sold by all sorts of people, producers, refiners, traders, speculators. And that's what ultimately determines the price that we see quoted.
So it's this active marketplace where people are always trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future.
Right.
With supply and demand, with geopolitics, with everything.
Exactly.
It all gets baked into the price.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about the history of oil. We talked about all the stuff it gets turned into.
Yeah.
We talked about prices. Now let's talk about the oil industry itself.
Okay.
How is it organized? We hear these terms all the time. Upstream, midstream, downstream.
Right.
What do those actually mean?
Yeah. Think of it as like a chain of operations, right?
Okay.
So the industry is usually divided into these three main sectors. Based on their role in the whole process of getting oil from the ground to the consumer.
Okay. Let's start with upstream. What does upstream include?
So upstream, that's all about finding and extracting the oil and gas. So geological surveys to pinpoint those potential reservoirs.
Okay.
Drilling wells, both onshore and offshore.
Okay.
With different types of platforms, depending on the water depth.
Okay.
And then the process of bringing the oil and gas to the surface. And really important, reservoir management. So trying to maximize the recovery from those existing fields.
So exploration, drilling, production.
Yeah.
That's upstream.
That's upstream.
Okay. What about midstream? What's the middle part of this?
Midstream is all about transportation and storage. So once you've got the oil and gas out of the ground, you got to get it to the refineries.
Right.
You got to store it.
Okay.
And then you got to transport those refined products.
Okay.
The gasoline, jet fuel, to the distribution points.
Right.
And eventually to consumers.
Okay. And what are the main ways we move all that oil and gas around?
Well, the biggest one is pipelines.
Okay.
So there are crude oil pipelines.
Okay.
Just for moving the raw oil. And product pipelines that carry the finished fuels.
Okay.
Like the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S.
Okay.
A big one. Then there's oil tankers. Different sizes.
Yeah.
Small coastal vessels to huge VLCCs.
Okay.
Very large crude carriers for international shipments. Rail cars and trucks play a role too, especially for smaller quantities or for getting to places that pipelines and tankers can't reach.
Okay.
And then you also need storage facilities, underground caverns, salt domes, above-ground tank farms.
Right.
All of this is needed to balance out supply and demand. Keep that oil flowing smoothly.
Right. So it's this huge network of pipelines and ships and trains and trucks, all connected by these strategic storage hubs. It's a massive operation.
It is. It's mind-boggling, logistically.
So that brings us to downstream.
Right.
What happens in downstream?
Downstream is where we turn that crude oil into the useful products we need.
Right.
So refining, turning it into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, all the different things we talked about. It's this really complex process of separating and converting the hydrocarbons in the crude oil. But downstream also includes the marketing and retail side.
Right.
So how we get those finished products to consumers.
Yeah.
The gas stations,
right.
heating oil distributors, all that.
So from the very beginning to that final gas pump, that's the oil industry.
Yeah.
And it's all neatly divided into these three sectors.
Yeah.
Upstream, midstream, downstream.
And it's important to remember, though, we talk about them separately. Often those operations are combined in these big integrated oil companies.
Right.
Like a major oil company might be involved in all three.
Yeah, of course. For efficiency and control and all that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about transportation a little bit as part of midstream, but it seems like such an important and complex part of the oil industry that it deserves its own focus.
You're absolutely right. Transportation is the linchpin. You can have all the oil production you want, but if you can't get it to the refineries and then get those finished products to consumers, the whole system breaks down.
The whole thing falls apart.
Right.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into these transportation methods. Pipelines, you said, are the workhorse for moving large volumes over land.
Yeah. Pipelines are the most efficient
and
cost-effective way to move oil across land. And they're everywhere, right? These vast networks that crisscross continents. So you have production happening in one place, refineries somewhere else, pipelines connect them.
Okay. And for getting that oil across the oceans.
Yeah.
We use tankers.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different kinds of tankers.
Yeah, all different sizes,
Okay.
Specialized for different routes, different volumes. You've got the super tankers, VLCCs, the very large crude carriers.
Yeah.
These massive ships that move oil on these long-haul routes, like from the Middle East.
Right.
And then you have smaller tankers, product tankers, that carry refined fuels to all sorts of different ports. You might hear people talk about deadweight tonnage, DWT.
Right.
That's basically a measure of how much a ship can carry safely.
The VLCCs, those are the ones you see on the news sometimes, just gigantic.
Yeah, they're huge.
And then to get that fuel to the gas stations we see on every corner, that's where the tank trucks come in.
Right. So rail cars and trucks play a role too, especially for those smaller volumes, or to get to places that are far from the pipelines.
Right.
And the tank trucks, they're the final link in the chain.
Yeah.
They're bringing that gas to your local gas station.
It's amazing. It's like this global ballet of tankers crossing oceans, pipelines snaking across continents.
Right.
And then the trains and trucks making all the connections.
To get this essential commodity to where it needs to be.
It must be an unbelievably complex operation to manage,
Yeah.
to coordinate, chartering the tankers,
Yeah.
managing the pipeline schedules.
Absolutely.
Thinking about things like the Suez Canal, that one little choke point that can disrupt everything. It's a fragile network in some ways.
Yeah, it is.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive into the world of oil. We started with its ancient history.
Right.
And the surprising early uses.
Yeah.
And then we looked at all the different products
Yeah.
that come from oil, the complexities of how prices are set,
Right.
how the industry is structured,
Right.
and this absolutely crucial role of transportation. It really brings home how connected we are
Absolutely.
to this global industry,
Yeah.
even in the smallest parts of our daily lives.
Yeah. It's amazing.
So as we think about the future,
Yeah.
this global production and consumption of oil, the energy landscape is changing so rapidly.
Yeah.
What do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for the oil industry in the next decade?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
It is.
A lot to consider.
Yeah. And if you guys want to dig deeper into any of this, I really encourage you to check out those resources we talked about today.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of oil. We hope you feel a little bit smarter.
Yeah.
And a lot more informed.
Absolutely.
Until next time.